Welcome to Dave and Dharm Demystify, a FinTech Futures podcast, helping make sense of the world of FinTech and digital finance. Please sit back and listen as the two Ds take a subject and discuss it to make it clearer and easier to understand.
Demystify.
Welcome, everybody, to today's podcast. And today we welcome Steve Flinter from Mastercard. Steve, welcome. And thank you for joining us, because today we're going to be delving a bit more into the quantum realm and talking about Mastercard's view on quantum computing and some of the things that it's doing. So, Steve, would you mind introducing yourself and just telling us a bit about what you do?
Hi, Dave, and thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast. I'm joining you from Dublin, so not too far from you, but based out of our Mastercard Tech Hub here in Dublin. So as you said, I'm Steve Flinter. I'm a distinguished engineer within the artificial intelligence and data group in Mastercard. I report up to our chief AI and data officer. I've been in Mastercard for a little bit over 10 years at this stage, and the last 6 of those years prior to joining the AI and data group, I worked in our R&D group within an organization called Mastercard Foundry, which is our innovation and R&D division. And within Foundry, I led on things like emerging technologies like AI, machine learning, and relevant for this call, quantum computing. So I help the organization to understand what is going on in the emerging tech space, what's coming out of high-tech startups, out of universities, and how are all of those technologies, innovations going to impact Mastercard, our business, and our customers' business.
Fantastic. And today we're really focusing on quantum. So I guess as a starting point, keen to get an understanding of what Mastercard's interest is in quantum and maybe some of the things that they're up to.
Sure, yeah. So we've been in kind of looking at quantum technology over the last 4 or 5 years, and we're coming at it from a few different angles. I think one of them is looking at what will quantum computing do on the application side? How will the potential that quantum has in terms of being able to solve certain problems better, faster, more efficiently than classical computing will do? How can we apply that to some of the applications and problems that Mastercard has? And there's a couple of those applications we can get into that we're actively looking at with a partner of ours called D-Wave, where we're looking at how can we make our offers and awards business more effective? How can we train our machine learning models better? So there's a few things that we're doing on that application side. We're also looking at it from the point of view of what's happening in the security and cryptography space, which I know is very hot now, trying to understand what do the developments around cryptography mean for Mastercard, for our customers. Digital trust is obviously an absolutely critical part of Mastercard's business. So we want to really understand the potential threat posed by quantum computing and how we're going to respond to that, and what's kind of hype versus reality. And that's a big part of what I've been doing over the last while, is really trying to understand how real is the threat, what we need to do about it, and where there's a lot of hype to try and demystify that a little bit for our executives and for our customers.
Which sounds absolutely perfect. Hey, Dharmesh, we need this. Because, I mean, obviously, Dharm and I, we met Sergio from Moody's and we had a long chat about Q-Day. And I walked away going, oh, there's an existential crisis or a very real crisis if ever I saw one. But what would be interesting is sort of your view, because obviously security, cryptography, all of those things are absolutely vital to the way Mastercard runs its business. Without security, I mean, you're kind of nothing, aren't you? So we're keen to get your views as to how much of things like Q-Day is hype and what are some of the realities that people should be thinking about.
Steve, if you don't mind sharing, like, how are you preparing for it?
Yeah, absolutely happy to discuss some of those topics. So maybe for the benefit of anyone listening who hasn't heard some of the previous podcasts, Q-Day is the idea that at some stage, some point in the future, we'll have a quantum computer that is sufficiently powerful and sufficiently fast to be able to run an algorithm called Shor's algorithm. And so Shor's algorithm has been around for about 40 years. It was developed by an MIT mathematician called Peter Shor. And he basically proved that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer would be able to essentially break the mathematical formulation behind our public key cryptography. So algorithms like RSA and elliptic curve cryptography that underpins transaction banking, card transactions, and all of the online security that we have. and to be able to do that exponentially faster than the fastest supercomputers can do it. So on the one hand, that sounds like the death knell to security as we know it. So we've been kind of digging into that and really unpacking what it means and how existentially important it is. And there's a few things I think that are worth bearing in mind. I think one is we are still at least a decade away before we will have a quantum computer that is able to run Shor's algorithm at the necessary fidelity to be able to break even a single encryption key. So we're still quite a ways away from that, and it may be longer. This assumes that the technology companies developing quantum computers are going to be able to maintain the pace of development that they've laid out in some of their roadmaps and milestones for at least a decade or more. So there's a big question mark if that's possible, but we're at least a decade or away from that. We've also looked at some of the research that asks, well, if such a device did exist, what would it cost to run? How quickly would it be able to decrypt our encryption keys? And the research that we've found that's kind of looked into those problems in some depth tells us, firstly, that even if that device existed today, it would take hours to break a key. So it's definitely not going to be real time. So it's not like a transaction that's in flight today could be broken by such a device even in a decade from now. And it also, the research tells us that such a device would take a huge amount of energy to run. Like one estimate is it would take something like $60,000 worth of electricity to break a single encryption key. Now, obviously, technology will evolve. We'll get other breakthroughs. These findings will be evolved and we'll have to update our perspective. But essentially what it tells us is even though such a device, if it existed, would be able to break an encryption key exponentially faster than the supercomputer, it's still not going to be economical to do at the level of, let's say, the cyber criminal who's trying to hack your card details or break into your bank account. It may be within the realms of the nation states who are trying to break each other's secrets, but we don't believe, at least now from what we've seen, it's going to be a tool used by the cyber criminal community.
So interesting, and thank you, because I think it's really clear. But I guess if I was a CTO sat in a bank sort of wondering about this, or a CIO wondering about this, what are some of the places that you could kind of go to find information? Because one of the things I've been listening to is the fact that AI is sort of emerging that could actually speed up the development of quantum computers. And I mean, I'm guessing that's something that you would know and understand. So what I'm saying is that whole thing of a decade at least, I mean, I totally understand, but where would I go to check the progress, so to speak?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that you need to be tracking this stuff in real time. The research is evolving all the time. As different companies are coming out with new technologies on a regular basis. So we're certainly not suggesting that everybody should sit back, relax for a decade, and then go do a Google search in a decade from now to see what's happened. You need to keep up to date with this. And in part, it's going to be looking at the roadmaps of companies like IBM, like Google, and like many others who are building these quantum devices and kind of tracking to see, are they getting more and more powerful? Are they getting reduced error counts, etc., more high fidelity? But we do have a very good idea as to the number of qubits. So this is the quantum bits that a quantum computer would require to be able to run Shor's algorithm. And so as we see these companies publishing their benchmarks and their roadmaps, we can kind of track to see, are they getting closer and closer to that or not, as the case may be. So that's, I think, one way to keep track of it. Nevertheless, I think there's lots that companies can be doing in the meantime, as working on the assumption that these technologies will be there at some stage. So one of the things to track is what's going on in the area called post-quantum cryptography. So this is essentially the idea that NIST in the US and equivalent standards bodies around the world have essentially taken the assumption that quantum computers are going to exist at some stage and we need to be ready for it. So they have been developing a range of new algorithms that will run on traditional classical hardware, not on quantum hardware, but new algorithms that will essentially use a different type of cryptography and be immune from the potential power that quantum has. So the first round of NIST algorithms were standardized just earlier this year, just in the last couple of months. And this is after a process of 7 or 8 years. So they've been actively developing this. They went from something like 80 candidate algorithms at the start of the process down to 3 that were standardized this year, with 1 more in the pipeline. So now we have a set of standards that are there, signed off by one of the leading standards bodies. And we've seen companies already start to implement those. So cloud providers like Cloudflare have built it into their infrastructure. Messaging services like Apple, like Signal are starting to build it into their infrastructure. So what's going to happen is a lot of the, if you like, the open internet is already going to embed these post-quantum standards into their infrastructure. Your browsers will get updated, your messaging clients will get updated. So from an end consumer, this is kind of all going to happen in the background and you won't even know it. But within the next few years, as these technologies are rolled out, essentially your open internet infrastructure, like your browsers, messaging apps, and all of the back end through the different internet providers will all be secured with post-quantum crypto algorithms. So as a consumer, we'll sort of almost get this for free over the next few years as these technologies are implemented.
Can I ask a really dumb question though, Steve? Without a quantum computer that is kind of capable, how do you know it's safe from a quantum computer that is powerful enough? How do you know right now? I mean, if it's running on a conventional computer, something says to me that a quantum computer is going to do it better, cheaper, faster somehow.
Yeah.
Is that a dumb question?
No, not at all. No, it's actually quite a complex question and a challenging one to answer, and I'll give it my best shot. So today we know that our traditional cryptography, particularly our public key cryptography, so what's called RSA and elliptic curve cryptography, these are essentially secured by a mathematical problem. And we know that today's computers need an exponentially long time to solve these. So as we increase the key length, the number of cycles we need in our traditional computers increases at an exponentially greater level than the key size is growing. And that's where that security comes from. Shor's algorithm, which I described earlier, essentially breaks that exponential link. And it was a way of demonstrating that it can be done sub-exponentially, essentially logarithmically. With other types of security, particularly there's another form of encryption called lattice-based cryptography. This isn't susceptible to the same sort of mathematical tricks that Shor's algorithm deploys. And so there's been no known algorithm that would run on a quantum computer or a classical computer that is shown to be able to solve these lattice-based cryptographic approaches. And so in the absence of having a different type of algorithm being developed for a quantum computer, today at least, there's no known method to do that. And given that people have looked at cryptography from a quantum perspective for the last 40 years, there's nothing on the horizon that tells us there's a new development coming. So there's something fundamentally hard about some of these new algorithms that isn't there for some of the earlier ones like RSA and ECC. So that's my best way of just...
That's really good. I mean,
understandable as well.
Yeah. So I guess going back to sort of NIST and its advice, and turning, I guess, to what MasterCard's doing as well. I mean, this is very much going to be the cost of doing business, is making sure that you have all of your algorithms or your encryption sort of in that post-quantum state, isn't it? So, I mean, going forward, if you want to do business in the US, you will have to make sure that you are sort of up to scratch on these things, won't you?
One of the things that I think everybody in this space agrees on, and it's one of the few things that maybe everybody does agree on, is this idea of crypto agility. And so crypto agility is the idea that over the last number of decades, as our IT systems have got more complex, our networks have got more complex, we've ended up with kind of cryptography embedded in lots of different places, in our applications, on our edge devices, our mobile devices, in the network layer, at our data layer, etc. And so crypto agility is the idea of saying, okay, we can't rip and replace all of that and make it all post-quantum crypto. It's not going to be economical. So what we need to do is to firstly understand where our crypto is, build up an inventory of all of the different places in our IT systems that cryptography is deployed, and then really figure out which are the places where we need to be able to upgrade that cryptography more seamlessly, more quickly, to either meet international regulatory requirements, new standards, or particular parts of our systems that we think are going to be vulnerable. So crypto agility is this idea of saying, how do we kind of abstract away the specific algorithms that we're going to use for different parts of our infrastructure? And if we find one is compromised by a quantum computer in the future, we can relatively easily swap it out for one that we know is not. And so that's the kind of the current direction, this idea that crypto agility will allow us to make those changes without wholesale rip and replacements where they may not always be necessary.
This sounds almost as expansive as a Y2K project. Like literally, you have to go through every single system and every bit of infrastructure.
There's an element of that, I think. And to a certain extent, I think this may be in the way that Y2K was a bit of a spur for organizations doing a sort of an audit of the quality of their technology and some of their processes. I think this may be a bit of a spur for that as well, to say that cryptography has become such an embedded technology. Maybe we haven't done as good a job of curating it, of tracking where it's used, checking the versions, all of that kind of stuff. And this may be the way to say we need to do a little bit of hygiene around that to get better control of it. And where we need to upgrade it, we can upgrade it. And then we have some of the algorithms that will enable us to do it. And where we don't need to upgrade it, at least we have an inventory of what's there and what's up to date. So I think this is going to be something that will take some time. It's definitely not going to be an overnight process. But I think as large organizations, both kind of banks, players like ourselves in the payment space, governments, etc., get up to speed with it, I think we'll see programs roll out to develop this idea of crypto agility and what's often called a crypto bill of materials, a description of the cryptography that's used at different layers. So that process, I think, has started and is underway, but it's certainly going to take a bit of time.
This goes back to, okay, maybe a decade off, or, someone was quoting, like, there's a 3% chance, I think in the next decade of Q-Day happening, and 3% actually sounds pretty high, to be honest with you. But even if it's a decade off, you've got to start preparing for all this stuff now, haven't you? And I guess it's like so many things that actually as you say, it's a great opportunity to take stock of what's in your organization from an encryption point of view.
Yeah, I think the other angle to that, and I agree with all of that, the other angle is that each organization needs to think for the data that it's securing, what is the lifetime value of that data? And what is the time span that you're trying to protect it for? Now, if you're an investment bank and you're trying to protect billions of dollars worth of assets, or if you're a pharma company and you're trying to protect the IP around your new cancer drug, or if you're a government trying to protect state secrets, the lifetime value of that data is enormous. And you need to do everything you can to protect it. And a 3% risk of a quantum computer may be very high for you, and you need to protect that. If, on the other hand, you're kind of sending around funny cat memes and texting your significant other that the traffic is heavy and you're running late for dinner, the value of that data is very limited. And so it's down to each organization and each end user to figure out, where on that spectrum do they fit, and what's the right strategy for them, for their industry, for their particular suite of IT technology. So I don't think it's going to be a one size fits all. It's going to be down to different organizations taking different perspectives. And as people read about the innovations and the government standards, they have to understand that governments are viewing this from the outer extreme, from protecting secrets, military assets, whatever it might be, that have a decades-long kind of security value, whereas other applications may not have that and may not need that same perspective.
For you in MasterCard, that's probably largely the case, though, isn't it? Like, let's say you proactively start to embed quantum-safe cryptography, but by the time we get to Q-Day, any of that data is secure anyway, and the legacy data is just old transactional data.
I think that's a fair perspective. Yeah, at least in our business, transactions are done in close to real time. We're introducing a lot of technologies even before the quantum threat around the idea of tokenization, which is finding different ways to secure your payments on your mobile device, on the merchant side, etc. And all of these are going to provide a level of security against the quantum threat kind of naturally. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes that will protect your online transactions, your online banking, etc. But nevertheless, these are typically short-lived transactions, relatively small amounts. So if we go back to the earlier point I made that, the best estimates are it's going to take a quantum computer 8 hours to break a single key. These things, even in a decade's time, are not going to be running in real time. So they're going to be, if they're used for bad purposes at all, it's going to be very targeted and largely, I suspect, not at the transaction type interaction that people have with their online banking, online shopping, etc.
So can we sort of switch gears slightly? And then, so we talked about cryptography, but obviously quantum and you sort of alluded to a few use cases before that MasterCard's looking at. I guess there's machine learning that has been sort of picked out as an area where quantum computing can really help. Modeling and scenario planning. And I was just keen to, because you mentioned them previously, just get a bit more detail around sort of some of the more sort of positive, proactive sort of uses that you see of quantum computing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good point, because we're going to have useful quantum computers long before we have cryptographically relevant quantum computers. So we're going to have quantum computers solving good things long before we have them available for cryptography or cracking cryptography. So I think it's a great segue. Within Mastercard, there's kind of two areas that we're focused on at the moment, at least. And I'll talk a few more that are maybe a little bit longer term. But one is the idea of, can we use today's quantum computers to do a better job of doing what's called feature selection for machine learning models? So what do I mean by that? Well, a machine learning model, and the specific example we're looking at is around things like our fraud models. Our fraud models have lots of different data points that we take in from all of the information we get from, your card, from the interaction that card has with the merchant that you're dealing with, etc. And then we have to figure out, is this transaction likely to be okay, or is it fraudulent? One of the challenges when we're building these models is there's so many different features we could use, so many different data points in each transaction, that figuring out which are the ones that are most predictive of fraud is itself a challenge. And so you can then turn that into an optimization problem to say, help me build a machine learning model that chooses the optimal set of features that gives me the highest level of predictability and accuracy, while also giving me a model that's very efficient. So can run at kind of Mastercard scale, do thousands of transactions per second in millisecond latency. So be able to essentially do a lot of inferencing, a lot of decisioning in real time. And so that's the balance you're always trying to strike with a high performance model, that you want it as predictive as possible to use as much data as you can, but also it has to be able to run in real time or very close to real time. So we're looking at how can a quantum computer help us to do a better job at optimizing the selection of those features that would ultimately give us that kind of, get us into that sweet spot. The other area that we're looking at is a totally different area, is the idea of a big chunk of Mastercard's business is in the whole area of loyalty and rewards. So how can we essentially enhance helping our partners in that space pick the right reward or offer to give to a customer or a cardholder based on their shopping preferences, based on their interests, but also based on the selection of offers or rewards that might be available in any given program. So we're trying to do a better job to get the right offers in the hands of the right cardholders at the right time so that they get something relevant. The issuers, the banks that are running these programs are able to leverage that loyalty program as best as they can. And the merchants, the shops, the online shops that participate, they get the best possible return on the offers that they give out to the customer. So there's two kind of radically different angles that we're taking by way of example in this space.
Fascinating examples. So at what point do you go, oh, let's think about quantum on a product, because I guess before quantum computer, you just use a sort of traditional computer, or whether you have supercomputers or anything in Mastercard. At what point have you gone, let's try quantum computing? Because I guess what many people wouldn't understand is the thought process, which says, well, actually, let's give this a go around and see what the quantum computing can help.
Yeah, I mean, one angle that we've taken, particularly with the quantum computing, is just to try and understand, well, what are the capabilities that these devices have? What have they got today, and what are they likely going to have in the short term, in the next number of years? And then to see where might problems that align with those capabilities exist within the organization. So to a certain extent, you could argue that's a sort of a solution and a solution in search of a problem type approach. But really what we were interested in doing is seeing how can we map the capabilities that we think quantum devices are going to have onto real problems that Mastercard has, and pressure test some of our assumptions around, is this a good fit? Is this technology going to help us solve some of those problems? Part of the challenge is, how do we get all of that data into a form that quantum computers can actually operate over? And today's generation of quantum devices are not great at dealing with vast amounts of data. They're good at dealing with difficult computational problems, but not necessarily big data problems. And so part of our research has been around, how do we try and deal with this kind of large data volume that Mastercard has, and yet leverage the strengths that quantum computers have for solving the hard mathematical problems?
That's really interesting. I mean, so we're sort of running out of time. Like all our podcasts, we could carry on chatting forever and ever, to be honest with you. I mean, I sort of feel like we've scratched the top of the sort of cover on the quantum computing hardware. But I do have a question, which is for MasterCard. When you think about testing out quantum computing and I guess the strategy around it, do you ever foresee MasterCard having on-premises quantum computers, or is it always going to be something that you kind of rent or work with sort of cloud players on? Or, it's a question that Dharmesh and I have been mulling over.
I think, at least in the foreseeable future, we see the vast majority of access to quantum devices is going to be through cloud. There may be a small number of research institutions that consider having their own quantum devices on-prem. And at some point in the future, maybe it becomes mainstream and we want to integrate them directly into our data centers. But today's quantum computers are very specialized devices. They require specialized expertise to run. They typically run at cryogenic temperatures, so depending on the company you're talking about. So they need to run at close to absolute zero temperatures. So they're not like buying a rack of Dell devices and putting them into a data center today. There are certainly companies that are looking at that and kind of taking that approach, but it remains to be seen if that's going to be how quantum devices get deployed or if they will be largely run by specialists in cloud environments. So my view is for the foreseeable future, they're going to be cloud, but I think we will start to see companies figure out if there's an economic opportunity to do it, figure out ways to get it into data centers and be able to run them on-prem.
I heard that the cost of a quantum computer, well, one of them was £41 million. Is that normal? Is that high? Is that low? Or what should a quantum computer cost?
I think you'd have to go to each individual company to talk about that. I mean, there are some announcements where governments and research labs are buying these devices, but essentially they're all hand-built, like one at a time. There's no manufacturing process per se. They're built by PhD physicists, not by technicians on a line. So depending on the device, they may cost different amounts, but they're certainly not cheap devices to build and make. And as I said, they're manufactured, not even manufactured, they're hand built one at a time. So we haven't got to the stage in quantum devices where they're at any sort of mass scale. They're probably where traditional digital computers were back in the 60s or something like that. They're still relatively early in their evolution. And so I think until we've sort of worked out a lot of those issues and got them to the point where they're suitable for mass scale manufacture, that's going to be the state, I think, again, for the foreseeable future.
Again, it's probably a really stupid thing to kind of ask or say, but, Dharmesh and I have been looking at like the history of banking, and we've been delving into kind of the old mainframes, which very costly, huge machines. And I think some of them are still ticking away in banks around the world. But obviously then at some stage there was the sort of PC revolution where things were sort of put into personal computers. Is there potential for quantum to follow a similar path, or because of the way that quantum works, is that just never going to happen?
It's exceedingly difficult, I think. Just the physics and the technology behind these systems means the level of complexity to build the devices is so much harder than it was in the digital era. One of the other challenges that we see now, again, you'd want to talk to the device manufacturers, but I think one of the other kind of benefits maybe the silicon world had is that as it developed, transistors and all of the early stage components were delivering value relatively early on, whereas quantum computers are coming into a world where we already have incredibly capable CPU, GPU, TPU hardware. So, the bar is very high from classical technology. And so building a quantum computer that can compete with best-in-class CPUs and GPUs, which themselves have continued to evolve over the last number of years, it's a very, very high bar. And so that's the challenge, I think, that a lot of the device manufacturers have, that they're competing in a space where the existing technology footprint is incredibly capable, it's well understood, and it's getting better all the time. And so they're trying to compete against this behemoth that already exists in the silicon technology space.
Yeah, because I think in the traditional computers, it's really a density of and and OR gates. That's literally about it. How many of these can we pack in to a material that we found? And so far, silicon's been the conduit for that.
It's really interesting. I mean, it does beg the question that, okay, is it worth it in the long term? Because traditional CPUs and GPUs, and they're getting better and better the whole time. And they do find new materials and they do pack things into smaller and smaller spaces. So is the race for quantum worth it in the end, do you think?
This is maybe one of the huge questions in the whole space. And I think overall I'm bullish. Generally, when a lot of smart people put their minds to solve a hard problem, usually they can figure out how to do it. I'm very kind of engineering optimistic, if you like, in terms of what we'll figure out as a species. So in that sense, overall, I think we'll figure it out, but it's definitely not a simple challenge. But I think some of the smartest people I've ever met are working in this space. And the fact that a lot of people are willing to bet their careers and invest so heavily behind it tells me at some stage somebody will really crack it and will come up with devices that will deliver that real commercial business value. Maybe what we don't know yet is like what industries are really going to benefit in what order. We talked about the financial industry quite a bit on this call. There are other industries like chemistry, pharmaceutical, etc., that are actively looking in this space. Maybe they might be some of the early beneficiaries of it. So it's not really clear yet where the applications are going to deliver real commercial value in a market shifting way for the companies that are operating.
Fantastic.
I think I'm going to have to lie down, Dave.
Yeah.
Just to absorb. I think that's been fantastic, Steve. Really have. I can honestly say I've learned so much new stuff. It's phenomenal. I really am going to have to lie down.
Well, no, it's been brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And I think it's such an interesting area. And I guess from my perspective, you can see that there's too much effort and energy going into it for it to sort of fade away. It sort of feels like we've been through the hype cycle. Now we're into the stage where proper applications are really being thought about.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think companies like MasterCard, all of the different vendors, I think a lot of companies now are focused on getting beyond the research results and trying to turn that into how do we build commercially viable product from these technologies. And I think the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we'll start to see a major shift to companies announcing actual applications running on quantum devices, solving some of these hard problems and delivering commercial value in a way that we can't realize today. So I do feel optimistic about the space, notwithstanding all of the challenges that we have. But I do think we're on a really interesting trajectory, and I'm going to continue to watch this space over the next few years, and be happy to chat with you guys at some point in the future to see how things have evolved.
Absolutely love that.
I'd love that. Yeah, thank you.
Hopefully not about Q Day turning up early. So.
I'm not expecting it, but if it does, we'll certainly have a view at it, I'm sure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Dave and Dharm Demystify. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tune in next time as we take another topic and demystify it.